Hello, everybody. My name is Swen Vincke. I'm the creative director and founder at Larian Studios. Last year, we released Original Sin. It was definitely our most successful game to date. It received a lot of acclaim, won several awards. And today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the things that I think contributed to the success of the game, and hopefully it will be useful to you in your own creations. So first, a couple of very quick facts about the game. It's a single and multiplayer CRPG. It contains about 100 hours of gameplay. We made it with a 35-man team. It actually was made in 2 years, although the actual development timeline would take 3.5 years, and that was because we made another game in between, which was called Divinity Dragon Commander, and that was also done by that 35-people team. So it was quite a stressy period for us. And it was our second self-published game, so we just started self-publishing at the end of 2010, say at the beginning of 2011. So for us, it was a very important game. So the structure of my talk is going to be first talking about a few lessons that we learned from our previous productions. More specifically, one particular lesson which changed our entire development approach and indeed our entire development philosophy for all the games that we are currently making. Then we'll go to talk a little bit about the funding of Original Sin, because that had a very impact on how the game was made. And then we'll talk about the things that we used to ensure the quality level of the game, followed by a whole list of tricks that we used to self-publish on a fairly low budget, and then hopefully there will be still some time for questions. All right, so talking about that most important lesson, it's very straightforward, and you all know it, but somehow people keep on forgetting. A lot of bad games are being released as a result of insufficient financing and having to adapt to too many constraints, and every single time, most of these games don't sell. And I know because I've had a lot of experience with one. It was called Divinity 2 Ego Draconis, and this was in 2009, and was pretty much the worst nightmare of Larian Studios. This was supposed to be our breakout title, the title that was going to define our studio, put us at the top of the RPG charts. Instead, it became our worst scoring title ever. And we basically just sacrificed 13 years of development, all our savings, 40 games that we had released, all the money that we put on the site, and it just blew up in smoke. On top of that, it left us with a lot of debt. So that didn't really work out as planned, and it was very problematic for us because we actually started doubting about our future as a studio, and we said, okay, well, it's time for some introspection. We need to look at what we're doing wrong and then see if we can fix it. So I found back the PowerPoint in preparation for this talk from October 25th, 2009. I'm not going to tell you the entire story, but suffice it to say that as we went through the list of things that were going wrong, we basically isolated two things. First of all, we were too ambitious, and we were too perfectionist in the sense that we kept on iterating over things. And on the other hand, we were not in control of our own game. We were not in control because we had third-party technology, we had plenty of middleware that we were using, and we were not in control because we always went through publishers. Divinity Ego Draconis was actually the first game that we co-published, meaning that we put up half of the funding with the money that we had earned over all the previous years. And as the game was released, we didn't get any of that funding back because our publisher had all kinds of financial problems also. And on top of that, the game was released prematurely. It wasn't ready. So these were all things that we needed to avoid in the future if we were to have any measure of success. And so we said, we're going to try one last time, and we'll see what happens. And we started our resurrection plan by basically fixing everything which was broken about Ego Draconis. We started making a game called Divinity 2 The Dragon Knight Saga, which was essentially Ego Draconis coupled with a new add-on that we had made called Flames of Vengeance. And with that difference versus Ego Draconis, that everything was fixed, well, as much as we could. Everything was polished, and the game was actually balanced. And surprisingly, that worked. We suddenly had a much higher Metacritic score, although to be fair, the Xbox 360 version had a 72, and the PC version went from 72 to 82, so a plus 10% score after 1 year of work. But more importantly, player appreciation was much higher for the game, and it started selling, and we were starting to make money, and we could actually pay off our debts, and suddenly you had a little bit of cash in the bank, and we started to think about things. And so the thing that really struck out to us is that, if you make a game that is fun and is polished and you don't release it broken, it's actually quite rewarding, both financially but also as developers. So what we really should do is try to avoid compromise in the future. So how can we approach that, knowing that we're the type of developer that needs a lot of iteration? And the answer obviously was that we had to go independent. So we set up a new Larian. We basically reinvented the entire studio, and we set down a couple of foundations which we were going to stick to throughout all of development of Original Sin, and indeed Dragon Commander, and even also for the new games that we're making. So the first thing was we needed to take control of everything. And one important thing was that we wanted to stick to our vision, and the reason we wanted to do that was in the past we had actually been designing games to make sure that they were going to go through the green light room of a publisher. That was not necessarily the best of things, but for instance, we had actually the core design of Divinity Original Sin was something we started working on in 2004 in a game called Beyond Divinity, and that was a turn-based RPG with cooperative multiplayer in it, and with two main characters with cooperative dialogues in there. And so we made that into an action RPG without the cooperative multiplayer, without the cooperative dialogues. So that was important to us, that we stick to our vision. We had to make our own technology, because obviously whenever the roadmap of middleware vendor deviated from what we were doing, we found ourselves into a lot of trouble. We needed to do our own publishing, because if we were going to invest again in a game, we had to be sure that we were in control of the revenue on day one, so that we could pay back our debts that we made while making the game, but also so that we could control that release date which was so important, because pretty much every single of our games in the past had been released prematurely with a broken feature set and player frustration as a result. So that was something we absolutely wanted to avoid. We also needed to reestablish our identity, because during the time of Ego Draconis, we lost touch with our players behind a corporate wall of press releases. And so we didn't really communicate with them anymore. And then, obviously, we didn't want to release any more broken games. So the secret that we decided was going to define anything that we were going to do from then on was to iterate until the game is good. And if we release it before it is good, then we'd better stop doing our business. So the plan was, we need to keep our team together, and since we were about, I think, 25 to 30 people back then, that was too large to start up to keep everybody busy with pre-production, so we said, you know what, we'll make two games. We'll make a smaller one, we'll make a bigger one. The smaller one will be released sooner, and it will then help fund the bigger one. So we don't have to worry about all of the funding for the bigger one, and we're just going to do the best that we can. And the smaller game was the game then known as Divinity Eyes of a Child, which is what became Divinity Original Sin, and the bigger one was Divinity Dragon Commander. So since we knew that we were going to be iterating, we had to figure out a way of funding all of that. And as we know where we start when we make a game, but we don't know where we end, we knew that we also needed to have a funding mechanism which was going to be rather flexible. So I'm going to share with you the list of tricks that we exhausted as we were making Original Sin. But first and foremost, let's have a look at what happened to the budget. We started with a budget of 1.5 million euros, which corresponded more or less with 20 to 25 man-years of work, which is not a lot for an RPG. And we hoped that we were going to be able to raise 3 million euros, which would have been 50 man-years of work, or say 2 years of work. And in the end, we ended up with spending 4.5, and by now the counter is higher because we keep on investing in the same game. The fact that that budget went up so much is a consequence of our decision to stick to our vision and to not release a broken game. So the question obviously is, where did we find the money? So we didn't rob any banks. We had, obviously, our legacy games, so that was a couple of games that were earning royalties for us. It wasn't much, but it had gathered sufficient money for us to start up and to convince investors that it might be worthwhile to invest in our company. And the way we did that is the trick with the SPV, or the Special Purpose Vehicle. So the idea is that you form what's called a project company in which you put the IP of your game, and only that, nothing else. So you don't put your entire development studio in there, you just put the IP of your game in there. And that company is then going to engage your development company, which is you, for different services. One of the services would be the development of your game, the other service would be the publishing of your game. And so your own company gets paid for it, but doesn't really take a profit on it. And then the project company finances it. And it finances it because it gets funding from your own company, in this particular case, let's say with 51 euros, and then from investors with 49 euros. So it's a 49-51 split, which is a very advantageous system for an investor and not really the smartest thing to do from a corporate finance point of view, but if you don't have a lot of options, it is something that will definitely be attractive to an investor. Because he said, you're putting up half the money, I only have to put up half of my money, and if you can offer me some collateral, which we did, which was all of our future revenue from our legacy of games, then I might be interested. And so we managed to make one SPV, and actually, because we did one, we then managed to set up a second one. So once we had that in place, we had our initial funding to start working on our game, and we didn't have to worry too much in the first year about milestone pressure and so forth. So we happily started developing our games, 2 games at the same time, so split our team in 2, Divinity, Eyes of a Child, and Dragon Commander. At the same time, we started announcing the game, and the reason we did that is because we had it in our heads that eventually we were going to have to raise that budget, otherwise we wouldn't be able to make the games that we wanted to make. And so we went to trade shows, and we announced very, very early. If you were to look back at what Original Sin looked back then, you wouldn't recognize it from the game that it ultimately became. At the same time, we started repackaging our previous games. We put nice boxes around it. We gave it different names. We remastered it. The Divinity developers got was basically Divinity the Dragon Knight Saga, which, if you remember, was Divinity Ego Draconis, wrapped together with some design documents, a cheat mode, and so forth. We also bundled all of our games again in a nice collector's edition, which we call Divinity Anthology, and that earned us some money. At the same time, we started discussing with distributors and licensors about some minimum guarantees being money that was going to be paid the moment that we were going to release the game as a guarantee for a number of units, and licensing deals being money that was going to be paid for the rights to publish the game in a certain territory. Now, given that we had done our job well in terms of getting some press quotes, that became easier to do. And so eventually we got some of these deals, and that was important because it showed to our investors that there was market demand. We then went to Kickstarter, which was the big thing back then. And there we raised approximately $1 million, but more importantly, we had 20,000 fans who were backing us. And that was really important because those 20,000 fans turned out to be the currency on which Original Sin could be made, for reasons which I'll explain in a second. Unfortunately, because we started in 2011, by then we were 2013, Original Sin was supposed to have been released already by the end of 2012. Remember, it was a smaller project, and we had fallen in love with it, and we didn't want to release it, as has always been our typical vice. So we decided to do something horrible. We murdered Dragon Commander. And we murdered it because we realized Dragon Commander was a fantastic game. It was heavily complex, but we had run into a couple of development problems, and we were going to need a lot of time to fix it. So we said, you know what? We're going to make Dragon Commander the smaller game, and we're going to make Original Sin the bigger game. It was with pain in our hearts that we did this, but it did help find another source of funding, because the funding we got from Dragon Commander helped Original Sin, and the game didn't do that badly. It had reasonable, okay reviews from mainstream press, and ultimately ended up with a 76 on Metacritic. But the thing that hurt was the user score, which was 7.1, because that was, again, something we didn't want to see. And that was literally because we released it before that game was ready. We then went on to make deals with the devil based on this. We said, you know, we have 20,000 players, and I read somewhere in an interview with Frederick Wester from Paradox that if you have in pre-orders 1 player, then you will ultimately sell 10 copies of your game. So I said this to the bank, you know, like 20,000 times 10 is 200,000, 200,000 times 40 euros times 0.66 is that much euros, so you can give us some more money. Surprisingly, they went along with it, but this was also due to the help of the investors who acted as guarantors, and they also asked us, and particularly they asked me to be a personal, to put myself as collateral, essentially. So I accepted that, and from then on, I lost all my hair and everything went gray. So we then tried to advance our revenue by selling off rights, and it was starting to become a very stressful time. We started even doing work for hire, the thing we had sworn never to do again. But Original Sin needed money, and we were happy to oblige. Well, not that happy, but we were definitely not going to release it before it was ready. So then, in January, actually in the middle of January 2014, the game was still not ready. We said, will we go to early access? There were a lot of pros and cons to early access. The biggest pro, obviously, being more revenue now, having people test your game, giving you feedback, more exposure. But the risk was that if it was going to go negative, then we might have ruined everything that we've done. So we had a lot of discussions about it, and it was ultimately Brian Fargo, and I will thank him forever for this, that convinced me. He said, we did it with Wasteland. We had some negatives, but we dominantly had positives. And so we decided to take the big plunge, and it was one of the best moves that we had ever done. Even then, we still managed to burn everything, because we kept on doing it. We said, well, you know, we have this early access money now. Let's put voice recordings in. And so we just didn't stop. The bank lost patience with us because we had postponed the release date multiple times. And they said, you need to pay us back now. On top of that, we had started doing a trick where we said, you know what, we're not necessarily going to pay all of the VAT back to the government, because they have this thing that if you wait for 3 months, then there's a small penalty, and we'll pay that penalty with money we'll get from release. Unfortunately, it was a crisis, so they decided that we had 1 week to pay, and then they put us on a blacklist. So at the same time, we needed to pay our retail boxes, because we had made these retail deals in which we were making the boxes ourselves, and we needed to pay the manufacturers up front. We needed to pay for the localizations and obviously for those nice voice recorders, which we started doing. At that point, we were pretty much beyond all in. And then we got an email from Steam, which told us confidentially the Steam Summer Sale will start on June 20th, 2013. And our release date was in the middle of that. So that was not necessarily the situation we wanted to be in. But then we started thinking, we said, you know, when you have a summer sale, there's going to be a lot of eyeballs on Steam, so maybe it's not such a bad thing. So we agreed to do a 20% promotion on day one, and then a 20% promotion on the day of release, and that was going to be it. No more promotions. And it worked quite well, because luckily by now people knew about the game. And the game went to #1 and stayed there for more than a month, and then stayed in the top whatever for the next 6 months. So it did pretty well. So how did that happen? And why did we run into so much financing problems? What was going on behind the scenes? Well, you need to know that we've tried to make a cooperative RPG ever since 1997. We had multiplayer in every single of the RPGs that we made, and every single time we had to remove it. And the reason we had to remove it was because there was always a clever producer on the other side that said, Sven, maybe you're late with this milestone, maybe you should cut something. Why don't you cut the multiplayer? It's going to cause a lot of QA, it's going to cause a lot of misery, it's not working too well, so why don't you cut it? And then often, well, 2 of them were named John, so I would have to say, John, yeah, I guess you're right. Because there's quite a few problems with making a co-op RPG. One of them being that there's no inspiration for it. You can't really look at other RPGs that feature cooperative play the way that we wanted to do it. So there was a lot of problems that we had to solve, and a lot of innovations that we actually had to come up with. This had a lot to do with the 5 design pillars. Pillars are a good thing to have, because it's like the things that you can match against your design to see if an idea fits in your game, yes or no. And the 5 design pillars were actually based on one overall vision. We wanted to make an RPG that felt like you were playing a pen and paper RPG with your friends. And the latter part, the play with your friends, that turned out to be the real problem. I don't know if you know the RPG Codex. It's a fan forum, but basic common codex knowledge is if you make a multiplayer RPG, it's going to be dumbed down. And the reason they say that is that in general, multiplayer RPGs are dumbed down, and that is because there's a lot of design constraints once you start making a multiplayer RPG. And to show you what exactly I mean, I'm going to do a small movie here. This is this one, yeah. So on the left side, we see player 1 who has animal empathy and can therefore talk to Murphy the dog. I'm going to spoil the game for those who didn't play it yet. So you're looking for, well, I don't need to tell what you're looking for. Anyway, on the right side, we have the player who doesn't have animal empathy and is happily going around the graveyard. So Murphy said, there's something fishy here. Why don't you dig up this particular coffin? So you do that. It's a bit badly captured. You do that, and you find that there's a sheep inside. So obviously not the body that you were expecting. So you talk to Murphy using your animal empathy skill, and Murphy says, well, that's not normal. Maybe you should do something about it. And you say, okay, yeah, well, I'll accept this particular quest, except that we don't really have quests, but let's say it's a quest. And you dash off, and you're going to start doing your thing. Meanwhile, the other player has been walking around the graveyard talking to the local people, and hasn't got a clue what's going on. Let's pretend. So he goes to the coffin, he sees a sheep, he takes a sheep, he says, okay, fine, I'll sell it. Then he wants to talk to the dog, except he can't, so he says, you know what, I'll just kill the dog. And as he killed the dog, the girl starts screaming, guards come in, and so forth. Now, the thing is, we wanted you to have that freedom. We wanted you to have the freedom to kill pretty much everybody in the game. We wanted you to have the freedom, if you saw a door and you figured out a way of opening that door, that was fine. You could burn it, you could lockpick it, you could destroy it, whatever. If you managed to sneak past things where you weren't supposed to go, you should be able to play it. We didn't want to block you. Pretty much the freedom that you want in an RPG. The problem is, that is a very complex thing to do, especially if you have problems like in multiplayer, where there might be another idiot passing around and doing everything to destroy the quest that you're on, and you still want to tell your narrative. Now, we came up with a very powerful design paradigm called N+1 Design. It basically boils down to the fact, always make sure there's a fallback situation. Design your game as a whole bunch of situations after one another. Make sure that you take into account all of the permutations that are possible because of the systemics of the game, and then design your story around that. So we learned a lot about N+1 design, and I think our next games will show the true power of it, but there was already quite a lot of it in Original Sin. There's only one problem with it. It requires a tremendous amount of iteration when you're testing things, because there's lots of things that players come up with which you would never expect them to do, literally. In our design philosophy, it's possible to kill all of the protagonists and still finish the game. And I invite people to try it, because there's only a few people that tried doing it, and they were amazed that actually the game reacted to it, and it was possible. It's hard to tell story this way, by the way, also. And that was not surprisingly one of the pieces where we took a lot of flack, but we have a solution for it now. Anyway, the temptation to deviate from this was tremendous. Because N+1 design is really hard. I mean, one of the things you want to do is when you have the option to kill all of the protagonists is like, why don't we make one of the protagonists unkillable, right? If you have a quest giver that says, and then you go there and do this and that and that and that, and then I'll give you the key, and then some guy says like, oh, I don't need to do that, I pickpocketed the key, then you lost all of those quests, and maybe you might tell a story in those quests. So designers and scripters often would come to us and say like, we want to change that. Right? Why don't we forbid to steal from this NPC, just this NPC? And we said no, because once you start doing that, then the end is lost. You never know. How can the player know? No, how do we know which player, how do we know which NPC the player is going to try this out on? Like, if he tries it out on a protagonist and the game reacts well to it, then he's going to start experimenting. And we wanted to promote that sense of experimentation, exploration in the game. So it had to be in there. But when you're under a lot of financial stress, it's very, very, very hard to maintain those rules. Still, we had learned our lessons from the past and we refused to compromise. And it paid off, because then we started getting quotes like this, it feels like a pen and paper RPG. And that was exactly what we were after, and so we were very happy about that. Another example of a thing that was causing a lot of delays on our side was our integration or interaction with players. Once we went into early access, we knew we had some problems with our rule system, but we thought it was okay. Unfortunately, or fortunately, actually, our community jumped on it and started pinpointing to us what all the problems were. And so there were two things that we could do. We could basically embrace them and start doing something about it, or we could just ignore it. We chose to embrace because there was too much common, or there were too many golden gems among all the things that they were telling us. So we made huge lists, literally thousands and thousands of tasks were added on top of the already very big task list, just to integrate all of that player feedback. We iterated rapidly, releasing patch after patch after patch, and we said, here's a new rule system. What do you think of this? Here's a new rule system, which mixes rule system 1 with rule system 2. What do you think of this? And it went on and on and on. We went back and forth, and slowly we started converging to something which was a lot better than what we had started out with. And in my opinion, we probably gained 10% on Metacritic as a result of that. I'm not a big fan of Metacritic, but it's a handy number to indicate how your quality has been improving. So let's just say that it's an okay thing. So it was exhausting, because what needed to happen there is we needed to make the lists. So we had every day, there was on our desks, there were long lists of what had happened, not only on our forums, but also on the Steam community and on fan community sites like Codex and RPG Watch. We then had to distill this into features which had to go to the team. We often had to convince the team of this being a good idea, because they said, I just implemented this. Yeah, but that didn't work because this and this. We think if we try this, that might solve those problems. It's something that takes a lot of energy, and you have to have your entire team behind it. But once they started seeing the results of that, it was something that was actually very addictive. It's also something that's guaranteed to delay your game. Then there was the polishing. We'd learned by forcing Dragon Commander out of the door that polishing does have a big impact also on how the game is going to be perceived. Dragon Commander is a funny game because it starts off tremendously, incredibly polished, and then it deteriorates as you progress in the game. And the part that was really polished got a very good feedback. It was only when people hit upon the parts that were not so polished that the feedback started going down. And so we said, well, in this particular case, we need to make sure that that level of polish is everywhere. And I'm convinced that if polish is the difference between a 7 and a 9 in terms of final score, and those final scores, as we'll see, are very important for yourselves. Unfortunately, if you're doing the thing that we're doing, which is basically integrating all that player feedback and that polishing, you're going to end up with a QA nightmare, and you're also going to find yourself inevitably into crunch. So quality assurance is something that is really important to set up well if you want to have this iterative approach that we have been doing. First of all, don't even think, well, if you have no choice, obviously you have no choice, but really try to get all of your QA in-house. Your QA in-house is so much more effective than QA, which is happening outside of your office, and I'll show you some figures in a second. You also need to try to get a lot of automated QA. When we were making Original Sin, we had 100 hours of content. And if you want to test all of that content, that means that you start on Monday morning in a normal working week and you end on Friday of the week after, right? So if you're a small team, that is very hard to maintain and to check everything. I'm the creative director. If I wanted to have a holistic vision of the game, which means I have to play the entire game, that was a very exhausting thing to do. So it is imperative that you automate as much as you can. And so we had this, we called them the world testers. They were running all the time. They were triggered automatically from our build server and started playing the game on their own using a whole bunch of techniques. And that really saved us because we only had 2 guys in QA in the office to start with. We added 4 extra people in the end of development, and that was the entire QA department of Larian. That together with early access and somebody who was scoring the internet. Now, you can't replace QA with early access because, as you can see, we had 15,000 bugs, of which only 3,000 came from early access. That's fixed bugs. We had more when we were released, but that was about it. 15,000 bugs is a lot of bugs if you have to read all of them. So just to make the point about efficiency, these are numbers from Ego Draconis. We once amused ourselves with seeing who was more efficient, you know, developer versus publisher, and we showed that we were double so efficient. But that has everything to do, of course, not with the quality of those QA guys, because they were very high quality people, but it was just because the developers are sitting next to one another, so that goes a lot better. Other thing that you need to be aware of if you make this type of game is that for each language that you add and for each platform or channel that you add to your game, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Because if you have it takes 2 weeks to play the game and you add 5 languages, that's already 10 weeks of testing that you're going to have to do. And then if you have 2 platforms, for instance, we had PC and Mac, that's going to be 20 weeks that you're going to have to test, so that's pretty complicated. If you then add a demo, which also needs testing, then you're going to even add more to your QA effort. So it's something to really think about, and I'm still amazed that we did it, but it had a lot to do, other than the dedication of the QA team, with the automated testing that we had in place. So obviously, it's also, if you're going to continue iterating on your game, you're going to end up in the situation that you're going to want to patch on day 1. And so since we had retail discs that we needed to spread, we said, you know what, we'll just put an installer on the DVD, and it doesn't contain the full game. So we put everything there, but we don't put the exe on it. And the reason we didn't put the exe on it, we didn't want any reviews of what was there. Because if we were going to give those DVDs to our distributors, they were going to send it out for review code, and then we were going to have reviews of something which wasn't as good as we wanted it to be. It's a very dangerous practice, and it blew up in our face tremendously. Let me show you how. So first I have to explain you about our localization effort. Translation into different languages, definitely if you're going to use licensing deals and distribution deals to fund your game, is going to be an important part of it. When you're making an RPG which is 500,000 words, that's a big effort. You can't come on the last day and say, well, I need to translate 500,000 words. Can I have it by this afternoon? That doesn't work. An average translator does about 2,000 to 3,000 words a day, so you can calculate for yourselves how long it takes to localize this. Obviously, if you're changing the game, including the story until very late in the process, you're going to need a localization pipeline which is going to be very adaptive. So you need a system in which you can say, well, this was the last time that the last export of the localization kit. This is the current export of the localization kit. This is what was translated. Match all of this together and generate a new localization kit which highlights the changes. We had this, unfortunately, it didn't work. And we only found out when we started actually testing the localization, which we did very late in the process. And so one day a producer came to me. We are short of about 100,000 words per language. And it's a long story how that was possible. I don't have the time to explain it, but it happened. And so we had to hire 20 translators at a time that we didn't have money anymore to 3 weeks before release to try to save the day. We almost made it, but we missed by 1 day, so we were released with several languages missing, and we got this type of mail. And the man was right. He was really, really, really angry. I mean, I left out a few parts because I'm not sure that I can put that kind of language here, but he was really angry, and he was right. He was right to be angry at us. I mean, we really screwed things up. But it was also a turning point for the studio, because we had gone all in because we want to make our game better. And at the end of the day, it is that people are going to remember. They're not going to remember the fact that on day one there was no German or no French or no Polish or no Russian. They're going to remember the fact that they had fun playing the game. And the graph on the right that you see over there is, I don't know if these are the actual numbers, but it was a producer, a publisher once told me this. He said, if you're making an RPG, for any percentage that you go over 80% on Metacritic, your sales are going to rise exponentially. And I think he's correct, at least from empiric evidence that I've seen, that seems to be correct. So from 85 to 86 or from 86 to 87 has a tremendous impact. So it's worth it, even if you have to take a lot of cuts and bruises. But if you do what we've done, and that's basically develop until the very last minute that you can, you are going to encounter accidents. But in my opinion, they're worth it. All right, so once you've committed to making a good game and put everything you can in there and put all of your cash that you have and your future income on the table to make that game, you still need to tell people that they should buy it, because if they're not going to buy it, then you're not going to have the income with which you're going to pay all of the debts that you created. And so it's important, and this is really important because I know a lot of independent developers that I talk to, and it's like, but who did you make this game for? And you put so much money into it, and you say, who's going to play it? And then maybe sometimes you find a new genre, but more than often you don't. So it's important to think about it before you are going to commit yourself so deeply as we did in it. Is there actually a target audience for what we're making? And the rule of thumb there that can work is you look at a game that is popular, what is state-of-the-art, you see if you can innovate on top of it, and if you manage to match the quality of the state-of-the-art, then in general you're going to reach the same target audience. So in the case of Original Sin, I think that was the case, that we matched the state-of-the-art in top-down RPGs, and that we added something on top of it. What's also important is that you need to be aware of your competition. We watch our competition very tightly, and I'm sure that they equally watch what we're doing. Because first and foremost, you don't want to be like saying, and I'm going to make a game which is going to be about dragons and Inquisition, and there's going to be rifts in the sky, and that actually, seriously, that actually happened. I have a main storyline which resembles it tremendously. You would be surprised. But you don't want that to happen, right? What you also don't want it to happen is like, say, I'm going to release a third-person action RPG in an open world, and it's going to be about a guy who's looking for somebody. You don't want to release that in May this year or in June. So that would be a really bad idea. So you want to be aware what your competition is doing. And we had actually this timeline, and we say, okay, those are the holes in the timeline. That's the moments when we can send out the message into the world, because that's when our competition is not talking. And we were really careful about this, and it worked also. We saw when there was a lot of chatter about RPGs or about a game which had a bigger marketing budget than us, then our message didn't go through. But when there was nothing, suddenly our message started going through. So talking about messages, it is incredibly important that once you start communicating about your game, your initial message is the right one. And your initial screenshots are also the right one, because those are the ones that are going to survive until the very end of development. This quote that you see at the bottom there, is this an RPG more or like Diablo? That is our mistake. We ruined our initial messaging of the game. It took us a tremendous amount of efforts to correct it. And it was only thanks to the press, actually, that we managed to correct it. They started saying things like, it's a modern-day Baldur's Gate, something that we didn't consider it to be. But that seemed to be a message that clicked, and suddenly everybody was talking about the modern-day Baldur's Gate, and he said, oh, yeah, modern-day Baldur's Gate. And but I mean, it was our fault for initially trying to reach too many targets, too many people in our target audience. We wanted to be and Diablo and Baldur's Gate and Ultima 7. Nobody remembered Ultima 7. And this was it was a big problem. And once you start amplifying the wrong message, then it's completely over. So be very, very, very careful with how you set that up. So once you have your message, then obviously you're going to need to spread it to press so that press can spread it for you to their readers and to your future players, hopefully. And for that, you are going to need to do some PR. Now, we call it a dedicated PR structure, but in a way, it's just a couple of guys working together. We had one guy who was coordinating all of the PR and handling all of the press requests. That was a lot of work, so he was quite busy. We hired a PR agency so that because they were involved with press on a day-to-day basis. And then in the territories where our PR agency didn't reach, typically because they were English-speaking, and we had territories which were non-English speaking for RPGs. Germany and Russia and Poland are very important territories, France also. We worked together with local publishers, and we hired their PR departments actually to work with us, typically for a cut of the royalty rate. The problems that occurred there is that if you have a team like us that wants to iterate and improve their game all the time, it doesn't really match very well with the PR departments who like to have like press plans and marketing plans and strict schedules and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, it often led to a lot of conflict, although everybody was of goodwill, but it was just two styles of working that didn't work well. So the thing that really works the best is to directly hire a freelancer with a lot of experience so that you can actually guide them and say, okay, well, this is what we want. Once you have those PR structures in place, then you have to start using them. And you do that by doing press tours and exhibitions. You can't expect the journalists to read every single email that pops into their mailbox every day, because there's thousands of them, or at least hundreds of them. But what you can expect them to do is that if you're on a press tour and they're like working together with a certain agency, to at least pop by from time to time. So we went a lot. We did a lot of press tours. We went to a lot of exhibitions. Exhibitions are interesting because you will meet press that otherwise you wouldn't visit. We also invited journalists to come to our office, and we did this from a very early stage, not only to get those quotes, to get our minimum guarantees in, but also to communicate to a whole bunch of journalists what our ideas were, what we were trying to do, so that when the release date was going to come, and more importantly, review date, we wouldn't face a situation where we have the guy who's doing the car racing game reviewing our RPG. We had that happening in the past, and that doesn't really lead to very good reviews. It's very painful. We also wanted to make sure that when they were reviewing the game, they were going to try some of the things that we had announced that were going to be in the game, then discover that they worked, then try some more, and then discover that there was more behind that there was more depth to the game. That was very important for us because we put a lot of depth into this game. So we toured a lot. We had to learn that you need to change your approach from territory to territory. The Germans are very different to the French, which in turn are very different to the Russians, and definitely different to US press. So that was something that we had to learn to work with. But it kind of worked. I mean, if you Google Divinity Original Sin, you'll see there's a lot of articles written on it. And there's a lot of previews. We managed to have like 3 previews from certain sites, in addition to a review, in addition to an interview. So that was a lot of coverage. And we managed to do that on a lot of channels, and that helped create that word of mouth. YouTubers was also something that was becoming more and more important as we were doing our campaign. It's true, at least we've seen empirical evidence for that YouTubers have a bigger impact on your sales curve than traditional media. When Dragon Commander was dropping out of the charts on Steam, and Angry Joe said that it was a badass game, we suddenly were again in the top 5. So that was a direct correlation between his review popping up and us going up in the charts. They are people who live and earn their money by people clicking on their videos. So that means that you have to accommodate for that you have to give them content which is going to help people click on their videos so that they can earn their living. They like to be creative, and they like actually doing things together with developers. So if you're creative about that and you manage to approach them, which is where your global PR agency can help you, or your local PR, then you might get a lot of coverage just by being on a couple of YouTubers. So they were very important for us. We also did a lot of Twitch streams. Those cost a lot of energy, and we didn't see that much of a return in it, but maybe we were doing it wrong. We tried to entertain people. It was important for our core fan community. They definitely appreciated it. One thing to do when you're on Twitch, don't forget to mail Twitch to tell them that you're doing something. Maybe they'll cover you on the homepage. That makes a very big difference in the amount of people that click on it, and they're quite open people, at least we noticed. Since we had Kickstarter, we did a lot of Kickstarter updates between April, when we did the Kickstarter, and June. We had, I think, 60 updates or so that's almost an update a week. We did this typically using video messages, because surprisingly that cost less time than doing all kinds of other things. We were present on all forums that we could think of, so going from Reddit to fan forums, to our own forums, to Kickstarter communities, and we always engaged with people who were criticizing. We thanked people who were helping, contributing ideas. This was basically, this was a lot of work, actually. It was really a lot of work. We did some advertising. Don't do it unless you want to blanket advertise it. We spent $20,000 on 2 ads, and we had 6,000 clicks or something like that, so it's not worth it. The thing that was really important, so yeah, I mean, it was a $20,000 thrown away, literally. The thing that was really important was monitoring everything that we were doing, because we were self-publishing for the first time, so we were learning what we were doing. So use tools like Google Analytics, or this tool particularly is called Engager. It allowed us to pinpoint where things were happening, and we could see which PRs were doing their job correctly. We could also see which PRs were not doing their job that well, and so we could intervene and ask them to do a little bit of an extra effort. There was a whole bunch of other amplification tricks that we used. The first one, obviously, being that we announced early, it had pros and cons. I mean, when you announce early, the problem is going to be that you have to keep on inventing stories for people to talk about you. But we managed to do that, although it costs a lot of effort. And for instance, one of the stories that got a lot of coverage is Dolores, who got asked if she wanted to marry her future husband inside of the game. So we made a special script for them. They had this cooperative dialogue. It was one of the key features of the games. And so they came over. She thought that it was going to be beta testing, and then he proposed. It was, it was an interesting scene. And so it was really cool, actually, because they did it a few times extra. They replayed the game then. Well, because she had found the ring and she wanted to sell it, so. That's what you do with loot, right? So I started the blog talking about industry experience. That got coverage. Our social media exercise was not that good. We're not really good at it, so we're still fooling around. We haven't figured out the right vibe, but there's people that do it well. Anyway, anything that can get people to connect to your game, talk about it, it's worth putting energy in it. But again, it takes a lot of energy, and you have to have that energy to put into your game. And then, of course, there's the reviews. The reviews, obviously, they're important, because that number, that's the thing that's going to remain after all the campaigning is over. And when people in a year from now are going to look at your game and say, will I buy it or not? And they'll look, oh, Metacritic 89. Okay, I'll buy that. So we didn't have any reviews on the release date. We didn't have it because we didn't finish with the game. We just kept on working and working and working on the game. And so there was a lot of people that were saying, oh, there's no reviews, it'll be bad and stuff like that. And so my answer to that was, it's not really true, because Steam, in the meantime, had come up with this wonderful invention, which is Steam reviews. So I could say, well, that's not true. There's 1,049 reviews. Just go read those. And that was a 94% approval rating on day of release. And that was really nice, because it became very hard for journalists who might not even have liked our game to say it was a bad game, because you have all those people who were really positive about it. So my advice there would be, as long as you have negative ratings, keep on working on your game. Don't release before that, because otherwise your sales are, in any case, most likely going to be problematic, although there's obviously lots of exceptions. So it worked out. We had good scores. But I think that was all due to the word of mouth in the end. That the game attracted sufficient attention, so there were people trying the early access version, and that as a result of that, we got the feedback, and as a result of that, we could do something about it prior to release, rather than having to release about what was wrong with the game in a review. Now, the problem with word of mouth is it's also a big energy consumer. You need to interact with your critics. You need to know when to stop interacting, because there's some people who will just never stop. And there's a lot of people out there who have much more time than you do, because you can't interact with everybody at the same time. But some of them just don't have anything else to do, and they're just active. Often there's nuggets of truth in what they're saying, so you should always pay attention. But, I mean, it can be emotionally draining, that's for sure. You have to be careful with your promises. We made a couple of promises that we haven't kept until now for a whole bunch of technical reasons. But we felt that we gave much more than we promised. And players always want more. And they will remind you of every single small promise that you made, even if it is going to be like, there's going to be a dagger in the game, and it's going to do +2 instead of +1. And if that dagger is not there because it does +3, you will hear about it. If you have a save game issue, fix it. And that basically means get people to send you the save games, fix them, and send their save games back. Yeah? I mean, you do not want to have community forums out there with people saying that your save game system is broken, and you want to help all the people who have problems with their save games. I say this because it's something that happened on Ego Draconis. It ruined the game completely. And we had it also with Original Sin. It's not abnormal that we have save game issues, given the size of the worlds that we're making. And there's so many permutations possible, so you can't test for all of them. But you have to do it. So we had actually literal people who were going through people's save games, fixing them and sending them back. People really appreciated this, and so they understand that you're doing your best. Obviously, you would try to avoid it, but if you're small, that's sometimes the best that you can do. And then, very importantly, never be negative. I mean, sometimes when you're dealing with vocal minorities, you want to be negative, but don't do it, right? Every time that I've seen a developer defend himself in a negative way, it ended up very badly for him. All right, again, because he doesn't have sufficient time to be able to react. Now, about sales a little bit. If you're selling in different channels, beware. So there's a couple of things that you need to know about the sales of a game. First of all, there's such a thing called as anti-monopoly law. And it basically means if you have your game at 40 euros on Steam and you sell it to a distributor, say a distributor in Czechia, for instance. We don't have distribution in Czechia, so I'll pick that one. And they are going to say, you know what, we'll sell your game for 5 euros, and say, oh, we agreed on 40 euros. Well, they say, I cite anti-monopoly law. Once it's in the distributor's hands, it's the distributor that decides the price. And they're right, that's correct, they're allowed to do that. And that can then mean that those keys, if you generated 1 million keys for them, those 1 million keys will then pop up on the reseller sites, and you're basically cannibalizing your own sales. So be very careful about who you sell to. There's ways around it. You can just say, well, you know what? If you want to buy keys, I'm going to buy my keys at the price that I set, which is, for instance, $40. And so you buy them from me for $28, and you get your 30% commission. But if you just generate keys and then have a revenue share deal, then they are actually entitled to set the price as they want. And sometimes that may be used against you, especially if you have a dispute with a distributor, and that can be very painful. So be very careful with giving out those keys. Also, if you have different prices, you have to be aware that players compare prices, and they will get to you, so you need to be able to deal with it. Sometimes you have valid reasons. For instance, if you pricing on the App Store is fixed, so there's little fixed presets that you have to use, and that's not necessarily the case on a platform like Steam or GOG for that matter. So you might want to have to explain to players, well, you know, on that channel we have a different price than on that channel for this and that reason. The one thing that I'm sure you hear this a lot in a lot of talks, but the one thing that's really important is lifecycle management. Your game is selling now, but it will still sell in a couple of years also, right? So don't be too aggressive in your discounts. There's this tendency of bringing revenue forward and saying, like, you know, I'll discount it at 40, at 60, at 70, at 80. But once you're at 80%, you know, you've diluted so much of it that you're not going to get a lot more. So if you wait a little bit and then you repackage it, then you can bring it maybe out again at a higher price point, and then you maybe actually have more sales than if you would have discounted it at 80%. So be very careful with that. For us, digital is 95%, retail is 5%. So it means that all the nightmares that we had with the retail weren't actually worth it, except for the fact that they helped us with the financing. So they were worth it. But you might wonder if it's really worth going down that route, considering these numbers. And for console, they're heading in that direction also. So this is an important one. This was, for me, a very important lesson, so that's why I wanted to share it with you. Aggressive triage. When you're making a game and it's starting to look like people are going to want to play it, you're going to have plenty of opportunities between brackets. There's going to be plenty of people who are going to propose things to you. And once you start thinking, because I used to say yes, You know, I said yes because I wanted to be everywhere. I said the more people and the more channels I'm on, the more accessible the game is going to be, the more sales it's going to be. But over the years, I started realizing that I was spending 90% of my time dealing with 10% of those. I was spending 90% of my time dealing with 10% of the revenue, and only 10% of my time dealing with 90% of the revenue. That didn't feel right. And so I started literally aggressively culling things that I was going to do and not going to do for the studio, in terms of following up on opportunities. And suddenly I had much more time to deal with actual development than I had to deal with the business development, and it didn't really hurt us. So be fairly aggressive in this. I mean, I don't have time to talk about specific examples, but you can easily spend your entire year working on opportunities which are not going to earn a lot for your studio. And earning these things is important because you need all that revenue to fund your next project. Right. Also be careful with regional pricing. It's literally a hellhole once you start opening it. If you do regional pricing, and you should, if you want to sell in countries like Russia, for instance, or in Poland, then you have to do regional pricing. Be aware that those keys are going to make it back into your US sales and your other European sales if you don't have region locks. So we are pro DRM free, so we don't have any DRM in place, although we actually now recently installed some DRM to protect ourselves against the fallen ruble. But you have to be ready for the fact that you're going to see your keys come back to you, and it can actually hurt. I mean, it can make 10–15% of your bottom line, so it's not that important. But beware, there's a lot of vocal minority or vocal community talking about regional pricing, so you might want to be careful with that. All right, so this is a very important one, and it's one that we're committed to still. We're actually preparing something which is, I hope that our players are going to be ecstatic when they're going to hear about it, but over-deliver. It's important because people don't expect it, and once you over-deliver, they talk about it, and that generates more word of mouth, and that is a good thing for you. So what did all of this cost us? Because you can see we did a lot of things. In the end, it cost us about 10% of our budget. We could probably, if we would have removed the mistakes now, probably have brought this down to 5% of our budget. So it doesn't need to be that expensive if you're clever about it. And the graph that you're seeing here is a graph I picked up at PAX earlier last year. What month is this? Oh, yeah, March. Last year, yeah. So, yeah, I am... So I arrived last night, and I didn't manage to sleep, so I'm heavily jet-lagged, that's why. Bad marketing, bad quality is 1 time your sale. Good quality, bad marketing is twice your sale. Good marketing and bad content is 3 times your sale, but then obviously you want to be in this spot is where you have good marketing and good quality, which apparently is 12 times your sales. I picked those figures up somewhere. I don't remember the source, but I'm pretty sure that the numbers are correct. So I think that with the original Sin, we were somewhere here, and obviously where we want to be is over here for our next game. All right. I had a section on lessons applied, but I think that I'm almost over time. Well, actually, I'm well on time, so I can just tell you what our next steps are going to be, and then it's time for questions really rapidly. We've learned to live with the fact that we're never going to be on time and never on budget with the games that we made. So this is a fact of life because we're too ambitious and too perfectionist, and we fall too easily in love with our own creations. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing from a publisher point of view who wants to have a fixed timeline and fixed budget, but from a developer who cares about what they're doing, that's quite okay. If you're willing to spend all of your earnings based on your next creations, that's perfect. All right? So what are we doing? Well, it's really simple. We're hiring people so that we can boost our ability to iterate, because the more people we have, the more iterations we can try out and more experimentation that we can do. We're hiring extra people so that can help us with amplification, so that the development team doesn't have to bother too much about the amplification. We're trying to bring a lot of things internally because we caused quite some harm, actually, among other companies with our iterative approach. We did cause a couple of disasters on the localization front. We did pay for all of it also, but still, I mean, we could have lived without the misery. So we're trying to bring a lot of things internal. It makes sense that if you have 500,000 of words in German and in Russian and French, maybe you start thinking about hiring somebody who actually can do the translation rather than work with localization companies. We are trying to stay ahead of our competition. There's a lot of competition nowadays in the top-down RPG department. So we have a couple of new things that we're doing, which I think are going to be cool. And we're also limiting what we commit ourselves because we learned, and I can't give specific examples, unfortunately, because of NDAs, but in the past we committed ourselves, so yeah, we'll integrate this technology and we'll do this, and it really bogs down your ability to be flexible when you need it the most, which is near the release of your game. And so yeah, and we're prepping to announce 2 RPGs, maybe at E3, maybe next year, who knows when we're ready for it, so we'll see. I will not put a date on it. That's it. So if you have any questions, now is a good time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to speak about the financial difficulties that you had fairly early on, I guess. I'm part of a 10-person shop that released a PC Steam game last year called Blade Symphony. And we also did Kickstarter in 2009, and then we released Early Access in 2013. And I wanted to know that if you had to do it all over again with another project, or maybe if it was the same project just later on, would you do it again? Given the negative connotations surrounding Greenlight and Steam Early Access and Kickstarter and whatnot? And what would you do differently?
Well, I mean, I'm not really sure there's negative connotations. I mean, you have this type of messaging which is negative around it, but when we went to Early Access, you had the same thing. At that time, Wasteland 2 was being flamed like hell because they were charging a lot of money because they had this Kickstarter tier for Alpha Access, which was quite high. So we sorted that out by saying, you know what, we had a $100 Alpha tier, and we said, well, we'll make it available for free for everybody. So we basically gave much more to our community than they expected. And I think that you can get rid of the negative connotations with a little bit of creativity and a lot of generosity. And if you do that, then most likely you can... I've never seen a negative of this type that couldn't be turned into a positive. It just requires a little bit of goodwill, energy, and creativity. So if I were to do it again, to answer your question, yes, I would. But probably I would figure out a different approach to doing it. If you go through the history of our Kickstarter campaign, and it's worth reading material, you'll see how we spin a lot of things that are going wrong, and we say, okay, well, this is going wrong, we need to do something about it. And you'll see us shift continuously to adapt to what community is saying. But they're important because they're your community.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions? No.
Okay, let's say that you were 1/35th the size of your team, so you're a team of 1. And you couldn't do everything that you did. What would you still do? And
I can tell you right away, I'll even pitch somebody. I don't even know, I didn't read the rules of conduct of this speaker thing, but you basically hire Tom Ohl from Evolve PR. So that's the first step, so that you have your PR agency. So it's probably one of the best PR agents in the business. So at least that you have some press. You shut up for a very long time about your game because now you don't have the energy to spend all of that PR that you need to do to be able so that you can bundle it around your release. You do find out a couple of key players, key YouTubers, key journalists who you can convince of your game, and you first spend a lot of time on your game so that when they get it in their hands, that those first 5 minutes, even if it's only 5 minutes, feel right, and then you go to them. So that would be my 2 main things that I would do. I would first make sure that my game is really good, or at least that my initial opening of my game is good, that I've perfected my message, which I tried out on friends and friendly gamers. Then I would hook up with a good PR agent. Then I would get him to hook me up with some key influencers, yeah, and then hopefully they'll pick it up. You know, I mean, if you have Angry Joe or Total Biscuit saying like, this is going to be a good game, you're like playing in a different league. It's all you need, actually. So you need to, likewise, if they say this is shit, well, but they're nice people, so they wouldn't do that. So, well, not to an indie developer, I think. And they would say, well, maybe you need to go back to the drawing board. So it's definitely worthwhile feedback. But that's, I guess, what I would do. You have to realize, I think that nowadays you have much more accessibility to promote your games than we used to have in the past. When I was starting out in this business, it was in Belgium. In Belgium, we didn't even have computers. When I was trying to make computer games. So it's now a lot easier to get suddenly promoted, but at the same time, it's much harder because there's much more competition. Like back then, there was like really very small. This thing was a lot smaller also. All right. So that's it.
Cool. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, I think that's about it, and that we should wrap up. So thank you once again, and good luck with your games.